Sorry about that. So we're talking about the double here. The connections the double has with reflections in mirrors, with shadows, guardian spirits, with the belief in the soul and the fear of death. The double was originally an insurance against destruction to the ego, an energetic denial of the power of death, and probably the immortal soul was the first double of the body. This invention of doubling as a preservation against extinction has its counterpart in the language of dreams. But when this stage has been left behind, the double takes on a different aspect. From having been an assurance of immortality, he becomes the ghastly harbinger of death. So this is a fascinating idea. I mean, it's mostly conjecture, right? But the idea that we could see ourselves in the street or a fleeting glance in a mirror and have this uncanny sense that we are echoed somewhere. It's intrinsically a nice idea because it gives us a sense that, you know, there might be some kind of persistence of the self outside of our corporeal frame, which we know is going to die. So that seems kind of intriguing to me. I get what Renck is coming from. But then Renck says, when this stage, this kind of earlier life fascination with death and also kind of immediate terror of death has passed by, when we start to mature and become adults and, you know, we're still scared of death, but we sort of recognise that it happens. Once that has passed by, the vestiges of this kind of almost unconscious suspicion that we have, or wish that we have, for this existence in a non-corporeal frame, those things don't go away. We still have this experience of doubling, but now that it's no longer being used by our brains to reassure us of the possibility of life after death, now the sort of opposite is true, right? If we're still having this idea that it's possible to live outside a corporeal framework, then that opens the door for all sorts of things like ghosts and monsters and otherworldly beings to exist. So this is why the double is so used in so much horror. Is the double reminds us of something that is impossible, the existence of the self outside the self, but that we spend so much of our early lives especially wondering if it's true or if it's possible, and sometimes even hoping it's true, according to Renck. Now here we're getting into the real meat of the uncanny and what's so fascinating about it for understanding scary culture. And this is Freud now, so this is if you're looking for as opposed to a general definition of the uncanny that I started the lecture with, if you're looking for a definite form of the uncanny, now we're starting to see them. So situations of an involuntary return to the same situation also result in the feeling of helplessness and of something uncanny, as for instance when one is lost in a forest at high altitudes, caught, we will suppose, by the mountain mist, and when every endeavour to find the marked or familiar path ends again and again in a return to one and the same spot, recognisable by some particular landmark. It is only this factor of involuntary repetition which surrounds with an uncanny atmosphere what would otherwise be innocent enough, and forces upon us the idea of something fateful and unescapable, where otherwise we should have spoken of chance only. So the eternal return of the same is an idea that's fascinated philosophers for a long time. Nietzsche talks about it a bit. And the involuntary eternal return of the same. So, as Freud says, being lost in a forest and going in circles and not being able to do anything about it, and you only know you're going in circles because you come back and you see the same stone with a particular etching on it or something. I love this idea because there's nothing scary about walking in a forest in the mist. It's an innocent enough situation, as Freud says, but it's the context that changes it. Once it starts to become repetitious, number one, and involuntary, number two, then it starts to become scary. And it's not just the involuntary thing on its own, right? Not everything involuntary is necessarily scary, and certainly not necessarily uncanny. But it's the involuntary repetition that's uncanny. The same thing keeps happening again and again, and you can't do anything about it. Which I think for me personally is an intervention in the fourth dimension, the dimension of time, where we as human beings have this experience that we're always progressing through time in a linear fashion. When the repetition happens, that shakes this. I mean, it's a core belief. It's not even a belief, it's a knowledge. The repetition shakes that knowledge. It feels like we're almost looping in time. Scary. This is the thing I really like. Freud's really strong on numbers. For instance, we of course attach no importance to the event when we give up a coat and get a cloakroom ticket with the number, say, 62. Or when we find that our cabin on board ship is numbered 62. But the impression is altered if two such events, each in itself indifferent, happen close together. If we come across the number 62 several times in a single day, or if we begin to notice that everything which has a number, addresses, hotel rooms, compartments in railway trains, always has the same one, or one which at least contains the same figures. Again, this sense of repetition, right? We all have a sense that life is essentially controlled chaos the whole time, and lots of random things happen. But when patterns start to emerge, seemingly from that chaos, we know that that shouldn't be the case. And again, this is unheimlich in the sense that it's unhomely. It's something familiar, numbers, becomes, it moves out of itself. Repetition and patterns start to emerge where there should be none. This is potentially unsettling. Something I want to say about this is this really starts to get you when you take human psychology into account, that once you start to see a pattern, you can't unsee it. And what I mean by that is it's like Edgar Allan Poe's speaker in The Raven. We create these patterns. You probably see the number 62 many times in a day, but if someone says to you, you're going to be stalked by the number 62 today, if you're, a bit of a superstitious or a credulous person, or even if you're just having a bad day, then you might start unconsciously looking for the number 62, and then of course you'll notice all the number 62s, and you won't notice the other numbers, and you'll be like, oh no, that person was right, I am being stalked by the number 62. So there's this way in which a lot of stuff that scares us, we actively create the conditions for it being able to scare us. Like the speaker in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, continually asking the Raven these questions. He knows what the Raven's going to say, nevermore. So he creates the circumstances under which he starts to become terrified. It's kind of the same with the uncanny in some respects, like with this repetition of numbers. You can create the conditions for recognizing something as a pattern, even if it's not actually a pattern at all, it's only a pattern in your own mind. This then speaks to the power of psychological horror, that we have the sense that psychological horror is forced upon us from without, but actually a lot of the times we horrify ourselves by the patterns and sort of beliefs about the world and the universe we live in that we have generated from nothing, and we use them to try to make sense of the world, but sometimes that process can go very wrong. Okay, so here is, it's another definite form of the uncanny is how I've subtitled it, but this is one of Freud's key claims about how an author might create an uncanny effect. An uncanny effect is often and easily produced by effacing the distinction between imagination and reality, such as when something that we have hitherto regarded as imaginary appears before us in reality, or when a symbol takes over the full functions and significance of the thing it symbolizes, and so on. So, effacing the distinction between imagination and reality. This example that he gives of something we've hitherto regarded as imaginary appears before us in reality. You know, a ghost would be an example of that. You know, if you saw a ghost, you imagine the ghosts are imaginary, I hope. But if you were to see one in reality, that would sort of shake your sense of the world to its core. The idea of a symbol taking over the full functions and significance of the things it symbolizes. A symbol is a fairly simplistic thing that can denote something much more broad. And the symbol taking on that full register of what is broad could again shake our sense of these different layers in which we understand the world. So again, think of these numbers. A number doesn't necessarily symbolize anything. It doesn't necessarily mean anything at all, but we can create meaning in that pattern of the number 62 because we can sometimes be overly credulous to, we can too easily attach great meaning to things that might not have any intrinsic meaning at all. So, to close, I want to refer to Freud's discussions of why the uncanny exists in the first place, I guess. Like, what's his rationale for that? Okay, so Freud says that we're vulnerable to the sense of the uncanny because a lot of the time we have experiences, especially when we're young, that we don't deal with properly. And he calls this process repression. So if you want to get past a situation like having been scared by a big dog, or you're scared of the dark, for Freud you might repress it, so you'll sort of push it to the back of your mind, if you'll forgive me the metaphor. But by repressing it, it might allow you to get on with your life and not be quite as afraid, but you haven't surmounted it, in Freud's words. To surmount it would be to fully go through a process, perhaps involving therapy, of dealing with this traumatic event, but most people don't do that. So this is the first thing that Freud says that I think is super important about, you know, how the uncanny can get a grip on us. The distinction between what has been repressed and what has been surmounted. So, the uncanny lives here in this distinction that we might have the impression we've surmounted some things, but maybe we've just repressed them. And that's really bad. When we repress things, a lot of the time as an adult, especially if we've spent some time thinking about, okay, why am I scared of big dogs? We might be aware that we've repressed something. We might not have gone to all of the effort to, you know, go back and maybe do exposure therapy or something to fully surmount it and to move past it properly. But we might at least be vaguely aware that we've repressed it. And that's quite good, because it means when a big dog scares us, we're like, oh, well, I didn't like being scared, but at least I sort of know I'm scared of big dogs, and, you know, then you're not going to be terrified. The problem really comes is if you think you've surmounted it. If you think you've surmounted your fear of big dogs, or you've repressed it so intensely that you don't know that you're afraid of big dogs, right? The effect is as if you'd surmounted it, but actually then when you see a big dog and it scares you, you're completely taken surprised by it. That's the space in which the uncanny lives for Freud. So here's how an author does it for Freud. Through juxtaposing realistic setting with uncanny events, the author, quote, takes advantage of our supposedly surmounted superstitiousness. He deceives us into thinking that he is giving us the sober truth, and then, after all, oversteps the bounds of possibility. So for Freud, we all think as we've adults, we've put aside childish things, and we're not superstitious anymore. We're not scared of ghosts. We don't think that the devil's going to come and kill us. All sorts of other things. We're not scared of monsters. There aren't monsters under the bed. We're not scared of the dark. So an author will present, if not a hyper-realistic scene, then a familiar scene, like staying at home in your bedroom thinking about, an ex, like the speaker in The Raven does. Exploring an old house in the countryside, like in the Doctor Who episode we're going to watch. Realistic setting, and then put something superstitious as if it's real in there, and that sort of breaks through our slightly overly porous defences against these superstitions we haven't in fact surmounted, we've just repressed, and that scares the hell out of us. So, to summarise, something that looks familiar but doesn't act in the way that it should can be uncanny and scary. Something that is obviously uncanny and scary or awful or just so unfamiliar that it's potentially disruptive or scary, acting in a familiar way or in the form of a familiar thing, uncanny and scary. Repetition, involuntary repetition especially, things that look human and don't act like human. These are all examples of things that shake our belief systems, our core beliefs about sort of rationality and the way the world should work. And for Freud, this exists in the gap between the repressed and the surmounted. So I hope that this has been vaguely helpful, and have a good couple of days and enjoy the Doctor Who episode on Friday, and I will see you next week.